Good afternoon, everyone, and happy Friday. On behalf of Independent Sector, I would like to extend a warm welcome to our members and guests. Thank you for joining our Reclaiming Democracy, Protecting Nonprofit Assets Through the Right to Protest webinar. My name is Nisha McGee. I serve as the Manager of Advocacy, Engagement, and Mobilization at Independent Sector. Freedom of assembly is a form of advocacy through which the nonprofit sector has routinely advanced systems change, legislative victories, and progress towards shared needs and objectives. In fact, many of the freedoms that are enjoyed today were achieved through democratic activities such as demonstrations, constituent participation, public assembly, and community organizing. Today's program will explore the recent increase in anti-protest proposals, how such proposals impact a broad range of nonprofit missions, and the advocacy strategies and policy recommendations that nonprofits can adopt to protect its vital tool to build healthier and more equitable communities. Today, our panelist is comprised of Ms. Nora Benavides, who serves as a senior counsel and director of digital justice and civil rights at Free Press; Nick Robinson, senior legal advisor at International Center for Nonprofit Law; and Shannon Ligon, attorney and nonprofit executive. I'll let them give a brief introduction about their experience.
Should I start? So my name's Nick Robinson. I'm a senior legal advisor at the International Center for Not-for-Profit Law. Thanks for having me today, and thanks everyone for joining and taking some time this afternoon or wherever you are in the world. For those of you who don't know, my organization, the International Center for Not-for-Profit Law, we work in the US and around the world to create a legal environment that protects the rights of activists and nonprofits. And we've had a particular focus, particularly in the United States, on the freedom of peaceful assembly and ensuring that right is safeguarded. And get more into this as we go along. Shannon?
Good afternoon. Thanks for having me. While I am an attorney, I'm here on behalf of Legacy Entertainment and Arts Foundation. I'm the founder and president. We are a not-for-profit interested in those that advance entertainment and the arts, as well as providing social justice initiatives. We also have a brand under our nonprofit called Lawyers Matters Task Force. So I'll be speaking on our Lawyers Matters Task Force brand under our nonprofit agency as well. And thank you for having us.
Hi, everyone. It's so wonderful to be here with all of you. I was finding both the unmute and the video button, so excuse the delay. My name is Nora Benavides. I am so honored to be here with Shannon and Nick. I can't tell you, just they are tremendous experts. So the fact that you get to hear from them and their expertise and their insights and wisdom is just tremendous and really a wonderful, wonderful event that Independent Sector has put together. I am Senior Counsel and Director of Digital Justice and Civil Rights at Free Press, which is a media and tech policy organization. We think a lot about the roles that media and technology play in our lives and how to connect with each other. And I just want to ground our discussion today in how critical protest is for a range of audiences. The right to peacefully come together has long been a vehicle for change in this country and around the world. I think many of the freedoms that we all enjoy, that each of us think about, were achieved because people have come together across the world and over decades to try to sound the alarm, to get people to pay attention, for leaders to pay attention, and think about how participation can be wider and more equitable. So I want to ground our conversation today in really just sort of hearing a little bit from everyone here about how they come to this issue. I think what I'm going to do is kick us off by talking about really the ways that these practices have fit together in our democracy. I think the title today is Reclaiming Democracy, and it just feels really fitting to turn it to each of you to contextualize how protest fits within the wider question of democratic engagement.
So obviously, we've seen the anti-riot and how that has really impacted the civil rights movement and the advocacy platform that we use as protests, and that as a freedom of speech. There's been so much legislation in my home state here in Florida, especially with Governor DeSantis. His pen doesn't run out of ink here. We've seen a national cry and this growing across other states. So while our not-for-profit agency and our Brand Lawyers Matters Task Force was one of the first to litigate, it was very important that we had also aligned ourselves with other national brands and agencies that were known for their protesting. So in my litigation, while us as volunteers and legal observers, we were also co-plaintiffs with Black Lives Matter of Tampa, who, they're known nationally for their activism and socialism. So it was very climatic, when he passed this anti-riot protest bill, but it impacted so many different levels of constitutional law violations. I was like, as a lawyer and a constitutional lawyer and a criminal defense lawyer, I was just like, oh my gosh, this is so bad, we have to fix it. So again, this became such a hot topic button and trend. Our litigation, honestly, behind it, trying to protect our volunteers and students and organizers, it turned and went viral. So just on its own nature, and just because it was a trend coming across out of the litigation, it became national news because of that.
Well, Shannon, I love that you dove right in. Nick, let's take a step back. I think that, the question of protest right now is one that I am thinking about a lot. And I think that a lot of people who exist in the progressive space, whatever that means, are contemplating the role that speech has in defining the issues we are talking about, whether it is how we're talking online or the questions of how we go out in the street and how we use our bodies and our voices in real life. But Shannon, has now mentioned something that I think we should spend a little bit of time, Nick, you and me talking about. You are, I think, one of the leading international experts now on this trend that we are seeing. And I want to sort of lay it out first, which is a trend in which policymakers around the United States have introduced proposals that would narrow or otherwise criminalize protest rights. I'm curious, first, can we just sort of hear from you a little bit about your research, and then we'll go from there. And I'd love to explore the various ways that social movements have been impacted by this landscape.
Sure. Thanks, Nora. And you as well are a leading expert on this. And so looking forward to hearing your thoughts throughout this and having this conversation with both you and Shannon. And I do think it's important to just, as you said, kind of center this, that, there's protest rights have always been central to the US experiment, right? Like, this is a fundamental First Amendment right. There's a reason that the founders put in the Freedom and Peaceful Assembly into the First Amendment. They saw at its core to kind of civil society and civil organizing in this country. And as you rightly pointed out, whether it's the civil rights movement or women's suffrage or the environmental movement or the LGBTQ movement or the abolition of child labor, right? There was protest movements behind all of that. And it's hard to really think of an issue in this country where protest wasn't critical to making social change. And so I know there's nonprofits joining from all sorts of backgrounds on the call today, but what I just say is, whether your group is actively engaged in protesting or not, everyone's benefiting from having, a space in which people can go out to protest. And I think we all need to be concerned if we're seeing pressure on that space and that space reducing. And unfortunately, that's what we have been seeing. It's becoming a much more hostile environment for protesters in this country. And this is happening in a couple of ways. So one is we've seen this increase in kind of militarized and aggressive policing of protests over the last several years. There's some pretty good studies now showing that policing tends to be more aggressive towards predominantly Black protests, towards protests on certain issues. But there's also been this long history in this country of using the law against peaceful protests and protesters. And so, for example, whether it was using rioting and incitement to riot statutes against, civil rights marchers and activists from the civil rights movement, or I'm in DC today, calling from about like 2 blocks north of the White House. And I always think about like the silent sentinels, who are the women's suffrage movement leaders who came out, during the Woodrow Wilson administration and picketed in front of the White House for 1.5 years. And at first he put up with it, and then he started cracking down on it because World War I was happening. How does he do it? He says, you're obstructing sidewalks, you're obstructing roadways. He started throwing them in jail, right? And so we have this tradition also of kind of cracking down on protests. In the last few years, we've seen this marked increase in bills being introduced and enacted that undermine the freedom of assembly. And this has really hit a kind of a frenzied pace in the last year. And so at ICNL, we've been tracking the introduction of these anti-protest bills since 2017. And I'm just putting in the chat, and hopefully this went out to everybody. We have this protest law tracker where we've been tracking these bills, and I encourage everyone, you can click away from my face as I speak, I don't mind. And kind of explore it a little bit. And I'd say, there's a number of common characteristics to these bills, but I want to highlight at least 2. So one is that these bills share in common, they often have high penalties for unlawful activity that commonly occur at a protest, something like obstructing traffic. And then second, there's lots of discretion provided to law enforcement to enforce these provisions in a broad manner. And this combination of kind of high penalties and broad discretion by law enforcement really is intimidating and kind of can chill constitutional rights. And we've seen these bills get introduced in reaction and response to different protest movements. So, for example, after the Dakota Access Pipeline protests, we saw this steady wave of bills that increased penalties for trespassing near a pipeline, often making it a felony penalty or engaging in a protest that disrupts the construction of a pipeline or that creates new forms of liability for organizers of protests if someone then trespasses or creates this disruption. So it's not just targeting protesters, who might intentionally or unintentionally step across a property line, but even those who are organizing those protests. And then last year, we saw the largest protest movement in US history. This is by absolute number. This is by the percent of Americans who went out on the streets. There's really been nothing like it in US history before. And that there's this overwhelmingly nonviolent protest. And it was just this real seminal political moment. But after these racial justice protests, we saw this spike last year in anti-protest bills. So just in the last year alone, about 100 bills have been introduced in 37 states. 11 have been enacted this year, with unfortunately more being considered right now. I'll just jump in just briefly on kind of what's in some of these bills. So, what do? They often increase penalties for blocking streets and sidewalks, which anyone who has gone to a protest knows happens quite frequently. So now after these bills in Arkansas, Tennessee, Iowa, you now get up to 1 year in jail for blocking a sidewalk. Many of these bills, as like the one that Shannon mentioned in Florida, are pitched as anti-riot measures. So they increase penalties around rioting or expand liability who's captured for rioting. But I think the really important thing to note here is that rioting laws in most states in this country are incredibly broad. And so they capture all sorts of kind of what we would think of as nonviolent, peaceful protest activity. So many anti-riot laws don't require anyone to engage in violence or property destruction. There just needs to be the threat of violence or property destruction. They actually also capture people who are just part of a crowd. So for example, if you go to a protest and a handful of people decide to kick over a trash can, the whole crowd can be arrested for rioting. And so, we saw that, unfortunately, in many instances last year. So Attica Scott is a well-known example of this, who's the only Black representative in the Kentucky state legislature. And she was arrested on felony rioting charges when she was protesting because someone in the crowd she was going through threw a rock through the public library window. She had nothing to do with it. And as she pointed out, she had helped secure funding for that library, right? So it wasn't about her at all. These bills have incredibly high penalties. So like the Florida bill, for example, you can get 15 years in jail for rioting, right? Those are life-altering penalties. That's an intimidating factor. I think that should concern anyone out there. And we see these other provisions. I'll just list a few very quickly. So like Alabama enacted a bill that allows certain municipalities to ban spontaneous protests. Several of these bills in Iowa and Oklahoma immunize drivers from liability in certain situations when they hit protesters with their vehicle. And several of these bills, and I'll just end with this, create new forms of organizational liability. So if a group or an individual organizes a protest and then somebody engages in unlawful conduct, the organizers can then face liability. So for example, in Oklahoma, an organization under their law now can face criminal fines for quote unquote conspiring with someone who engages in an unlawful assembly or just remains at the scene of a riot. So no one has to do and no one that you're affiliated with has to do anything that we would think of as violent conduct in any way. And so these kind of language is really concerning, I think, particularly for nonprofits, about how they can get caught up in these kind of broadly worded forms of nonviolent collective liability.
It's really interesting, Nick, and I'm honestly just so glad you give some texture to these different bills. I find that the sort of headlines can make these feel like abstract threats, and I think any of the controversial issues of the day can often feel like they're not going to affect me. And so part of what I have, or you, or the people in my sphere, whatever that is, and so I remember in the research days when I was beginning to look at some of this. One, in part, I was really sort of inspired as a civil rights lawyer to see the ICNL protest law tracker. One, because it starts building a record for us of just the breadth and the pace of introduction of proposals. I remember back in 2015, there was sort of the beginning of very broad movement and social demonstration towards progress for both the Dakota Pipeline, Native-led protests, and Black Lives Matter. And at that time, there was very little happening at the legislative level to criminalize these movements. And then I really do believe the 2016 election was a kind of watershed moment. A lot of state houses gained largely Republican control. I think there was a kind of rhetoric that came from the White House by 2017 that seemed to empower legislators to feel like they could weigh in on this issue, which I'm glad, Nick, you mentioned the First Amendment. I do believe there is often a misconception that protest is this inherently violent act. And I always try to remind us what anecdotes we have of how protest is used. And in the last year alone, the George Floyd and the solidarity movements around George Floyd protests really have been largely peaceful. And yet, what are we seeing? This continued rise, and Nick, just the fervor that you sort of described the last year of legislative proposals is not only seeing more bills, but more steeper criminal penalties, a kind of almost widening of what is criminalized, who would be criminalized. I think if you or I taught a First Amendment session and then someone that we were training got arrested, in some states that could be seen as our liability. It really is, to me, a very surreal circumstance. And I'll be honest, I feel I existed in a space where people thought I was speculating when I said this will lead to less people protesting. A lot of people said to me, well, do we really know that? Just the mere introduction of proposals, will that actually affect people going out or choosing not to? Are people even aware of these proposals? Was a question I got. And I'm not a, I don't have a crystal ball. I also couldn't speak with organizers around the whole country about every bill they had heard or not heard of. But I want to bring Shannon, you into this conversation now because of what has happened in Florida. And I think that it is a really powerful moment for us. I want to give just a brief summary of what's happening, and then I really want to turn it to you to talk about how you're involved in this. So as I've mentioned now, there's sort of been this, question mark of will these anti-protest laws and the proposals that don't even become law, will they chill people's expression and protest rights? The law in Florida that Shannon has already mentioned is one that I think has inspired many proposals around the country, and it is currently being challenged in district court at the district court level in Florida. Just a couple weeks ago, the judge in that case explicitly said this law will chill protest. And I have to be honest, I got goosebumps everywhere when I read that ruling, Shannon. It felt like, I almost started crying. I was so moved, to think that from a justice perspective, we recognize the effect that criminal sanctions and the movement to try to narrow our rights will have on our rights. It feels intuitive to me. I think it would be intuitive to Nick or to you. Can you just sort of tell us, one, what's your experience in this space in Florida? And then let's talk a little bit about some of the strategies that we can think about deploying as we're combating similar efforts.
Sure. So I was actually one of those young, naive kids that thought protesting was antiquated. It didn't work. If it worked, why won't we have change? And it really took my mentor, attorney Natalie Jackson, who she works a lot with, Ben Crump, to take me out to a protest so I could see how you use the people when you're not getting justice in the streets, and to bring the media attention and the fanfare and how peaceful protests actually work. So that took a whole 180 mind shift for me. And now I look back at what I've been doing from 2014, because I worked on the Trayvon Martin case. And, in 2016, I started Lawyers Matters on the eve of the George Floyd protests. So protesting became important in my life. And so when I saw these laws change, impacting people's ability to do so, that's kind of how it impacted our organization. So we really work as legal observers. So we come out to the protests as volunteers to not only protect the protesters, but also law enforcement, the churches that do them. Like I've protested for, higher wages for teachers. Even I represented, clients that have protested for the NFL. So this is like, in my blood type thing. But what happened when DeSantis passed this law, I said, as a volunteer, I don't want to go out there even as a lawyer, because one, I get arrested. I don't get to see a judge in 6 months because of the way that law was written. But really, it was like, I didn't want to put my student volunteers, my teacher volunteers at risk, because I didn't, we were in this gray area. So there's actually 2 cases in Florida pending. We filed in the Middle District of Florida, and then the ACLU, a little bit smarter because they got a little bit more favoritism, they filed in the Northern District of Florida. And so again, as you can see, these nonprofit agencies are really doing reform. We're talking the talk and walking the walk. So what happened in the Middle District, we're 11th Circuit, it's very hard, it's very restrictive and conservative. Our judge basically said our group, we didn't show damages. And now our case is actually, I filed an appeal on it, but what happened is the Northern District said, hey, no, this law is wrong. Let's put a chill on this law. So we have kind of in our own state a little conflict now, but hopefully we'll be able to consolidate those things, because now I have DeSantis in the Northern District saying he's going to appeal that decision. So I still feel right now they have it right. And going to your point, Nora, the judge in the Northern District, in his order, he did a very good job giving the history and the historical outline on why protesting is so important. And so my lawyer in this case, which is my buddy, I told him what we were doing. I was like, this is a real moment in history, even though we're doing this pro bono, we want to get it right because everyone is watching. So I'm thankful that the Northern District and that judge got it right. But I'm also grateful in his order, he outlined the historical value of what and why protesting is so important. And so that's why in my instance. I went from volunteering and protesting 4 to 7 times a year to we did none during this historic era. So that's why I told him, I said, I'll just fill out an affidavit and testify saying I went from doing protests to not doing it, and there's our damages, right there. However, this is I'm, so glad to speak on this because the law has changed. We went from not protesting to I just filled 2 calls asking people, can we start sending you leads in case people get, wrongfully protested, or can you come out and volunteer as legal observers? So we went from having this law, not doing anything till it just passed till this week, our organization is getting asked to come out and, do more community service and things. So I'm glad to see the change in the current, but, it impacted our organization a lot.
Can I just follow up on, this is something we're hearing from a lot of the Florida groups. And if you look at kind of the affidavits that were filed in that, it's just striking to me of group after group in Florida saying, yeah, we had these plans to protest and now we're not because we're afraid of this bill, because we're afraid of how broad the rioting law is in Florida and how it can capture peaceful protests and, lead to felony jail time, right? This is no joke, right? And not only is it that, but this feeling, and I kind of want to keep re-emphasizing this point, that these laws come with high penalties and they come with a ton of discretion, right? It's really up to law enforcement on the ground to decide, am I going to arrest this person? And if I am arresting this person, what am I going to arrest? Is it going to be for some, minor misdemeanor? Is it going to be for some, a felony? And that discretion really puts a lot of politicization, I think, into all of these laws.
I will, in my discretion as moderator, get to weigh in here on a point that I have been more and more troubled by, which is since the George Floyd protests of the last year, that uptick in bills being introduced, when you look at what they do, they've grown worse. Like the proposals from 2017, 2018, 2019 are horrible. So in no way am I saying, I'll settle for those. But, they're all threats to our democracy and to equitable expression. But what I've seen of late is a kind of growing proliferation of bills that would do more than just criminalize protest, and try to widen what is seen as rioting. What I've noticed actually is this new increase in proposals that actually ban and would limit protesters convicted or charged with something related to their demonstration, that would limit their ability to do a number of things. One of them is I've seen proposals that would limit protesters arrested or convicted of running for office. I've seen bills that would limit those charged or convicted of something related to protest from being eligible for public benefits at the state level. There are these ways that now, I had existed in sort of this space of thinking about the First Amendment implications, the free expression implications. And luckily we have these experts sounding the alarm. And what I've noticed now is that when we think about a topic like this, the sort of big tent democracy conversation, these bills seem to now be implicating a broader array of our rights. And I don't know if I have a question in there. I just sort of want to hear your reactions from both of you, because it feels like an audience of nonprofit experts, administrators, and executives are likely thinking about their own advocacy on whatever issues, their own tactics and strategies to do the work they do. And I am seeing these really kind of troubling movements to restrict not just the free speech implications and protest rights, but just sort of like, where do you sit with all of this, both of you?
I'll let you go first, Nick.
I was going to call you out, Shannon. I was going to say, you've been with Ben Crump, where do we put this in the broader civil rights arena?
Well, I mean, I feel the lawyer in me wants to say to be determined, because until I feel like we get definicy here in Florida, appeal, I'm taking the win in the Northern District as our win. Again, to Nick's point, there's 11 other states and pending movements across the nation. So, we're dealing with a state law. So I'm curious to see, how will federal regulation, so we kind of just cease this moment. But again, I'm concerned, not only for protests, but I'm just seeing the stripping away of our First Amendment rights. It started with President Trump's Twitter account. And, I've gotten censored on social media myself as of late. So we're constantly seeing our rights stripped in this First Amendment space. But I do think, since Florida was the first to act on this, it opened a door to say, like, hey, no, this is a fundamental constitutional right, and something so important as our freedom to speech, organize, and protest is something that we need to be protected. So again, I think here in Florida, we had, and as a Black female, I'm not scared to speak on it, we had our legislation speak against, the Black Lives Matter movement and the protests. Because if you look what happened in Florida, DeSantis was fine with the Cuban protests, after we had, that outcry. So again, I think we have some smart people in our legislature and our judicial system that are going to look at the political and, if not racial, undertones of why some of these things are speaking out. So again, our civil rights and our First Amendment attorneys, I think, where we saw not a lot of movement and attention in this space, it's become so sensationalized and so much attention. I think, while we're trying to put a damper in some of it, I think it's opening up the door to saying, hey, when are we going to protect ourselves, and how much limitations are we going to give around our rights to protest and just, the First Amendment?
No, I think that's right. And then kind of building on both of your points, the laws have been changing. It's been getting worse and worse every year, as you say, Nora, right? Like just these driver liability bills, right, that basically reduce or immunize drivers in certain circumstances if they hit protesters with their vehicle. These got introduced, way back in 2015, 16, in reaction to the first wave of Black Lives Matter protests. Then Charlottesville happened, and I think it was like, oh, we can't have, literally we see people dying when they get hit by cars. But then after this last wave, you saw of racial justice protests, you saw a whole new set of bills, and these bills getting enacted. And I think the concerning part here is not even just the enactment, but the messaging and the signaling that this is sending out, right? There's already not only a problem for protesters that they're facing from confrontation with the police, but also from aggressiveness from third parties. We've had well over 100 protesters were hit with vehicles last year at Black Lives Matter protests. We have armed protesters showing up as counter protesters. And we have this ratcheting up of rhetoric. And I think it's important to remember that in a way in the US, we're actually in this remarkably peaceful time in terms of political violence. If you go back into the 19th century, this is not the history of the US. The history of the US is one of violence, right? It's of the Civil War, it's of lynchings, it's of labor struggles, and it's of anti-Catholic riots, anti-Mormon riots, anti-immigrant riots, right? We had all these things happen in our history. And what I worry about is that these laws are sending a signal to ratchet up when we should be trying to calm down the temperature and engaging in kind of these peaceful ways. We have lawmakers almost encouraging violence of Americans against Americans. And I think that's really a concerning development. And I think it's counterproductive for everybody, right? This shouldn't be a left or right issue. And I don't think it helps anyone to be doing this. And similarly on protests, we can talk about the racial justice protests, but if you're on, there's right to life protests, or there's, protests around COVID restrictions, or whatever it is, it's the Tea Party movement was built out of, a whole set of protests, right? This isn't a partisan issue. People mobilize on all sides of the political spectrum, and they should mobilize on all sides of the political spectrum, in the streets. And we need to have laws that protect that, and these laws are going after that that space. And right now they might be used in like this politicized and discretionary way against certain activists. And that's very real. But I think everyone should realize part of the reason we should push back on this is it's bad for everybody, whatever your issue is. These are laws that limit the ability of you to go out and speak.
And if I could,
Yeah, Shannon, jump
I
in.
just kind of wanted to touch on something Nick said, and just speaking about, you know, it overreaching into laws, especially in here in Florida. One of the component of our protest law was if a person drove into others while protesting, it gave that person sovereign immunity. So on one hand, we had a huge First Amendment issue, but then on the other hand, we had something that we also litigate heavily and trying to strike down as law here is sovereign immunity, which is also known under here as like your stand your ground law. So what I really saw is two parts to piggybacking off Nick is our law served as almost a dog whistle to say like, hey, now if you're protesting, now you have sovereign immunity. If you go drive over a protester, you've escaped civil, you know, liability, and you can't, you know, get sued or arrested behind it. So it gave them additional kind of stand your ground issue. But I also saw it as a way to incite counter protesters to come and escape liability, on top of it looking like a First Amendment protest issue, but it really was also a sovereign immunity and standing issue. So again, these laws, you know, are over breath because they're taking over a lot of complex constitutional issues. But to Nick's point, you know, I'm a lawyer saying we have too many laws, strike them down.
There's a tension I often feel in and you both are now speaking to it, where one, I am so glad, Nick, that you say the defense of freedom of assembly and the broader notion of freedom of expression should serve everyone. I fundamentally believe that. And there's sort of this other tension, though, that I've been raised legally, so to speak, you know, in my First Amendment jurisprudence, and I agree with that. And yet in practice, I feel that that issue of discretion will allow law enforcement in the states where these become laws to really kind of pick and choose who is acceptable. You know, what speech is allowable and okay, and then what isn't. And I am in the position often of seeing the way progressive and racial justice protests are clearly targeted and criminalized more. And that is an uncomfortable truth. It reminds me of the civil rights era, when public nuisance and ordinance laws were introduced explicitly to limit and criminalize civil rights leaders. So it kind of has these echoes. And there's a part of me that is like, well, where do we go from here? I mean, you know, if we know the First Amendment enshrines this right, there has to be some other pivot that we make. And so I want to turn first, Nick, to you in thinking about that proactive question. Like, you know, where do we go if we're faced with this circumstance that I think now all three of us understand? We understand the kind of very viewpoint discriminatory ways these bills can target speech. And yet the openness and the need for openness should benefit everyone. So what can we do? How do we think about proactive policies? Can there maybe even be, well, let's start with proactive policies and then I'll turn to Shannon.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for that. Yeah, no, and I very much agree on that tension. And I think, you know, this has not been lost that we've seen on a lot of jurisdictions, that we've just seen this kind of unacceptable, aggressive policing of protests. And so at the same time that we're seeing this record number of anti-protest bills being introduced and enacted, in another set of jurisdictions, particularly at the municipality level, but also at the state level, we see laws being enacted and introduced that would better protect protest rights, that are responding to kind of some of what was, to be honest, just systematic rights violations of protesters last year. I think there's really no other way to kind of categorize what occurred. And this is happening in a number of ways. And I'm going to put in the chat, we have a proactive tracker. So while we keep track of anti-protest laws across the country, we're also trying to keep track of things that jurisdictions that are doing that better protect protest rights. And so that can be a whole host of things. So one, it might be trying to reform some of these public order laws we've been talking about. So if part of the challenge in Florida is that the riot law is just so incredibly broad that can capture almost anyone and kind of any kind of protest. There's states and here in Washington, D.C., they've been thinking a lot about like, how do we better target? First, do we need a riot law at all? And then second, if we are going to have a riot law, how can we make it as targeted as possible so it only captures those who are actually engaged in violence in some way or something like that. So you don't have these chilling repercussions. But we also see states and municipalities doing other things. So, last year during the racial justice protests, we saw law enforcement use tear gas and rubber bullets in over 100 cities across the country. We had hundreds of people be injured. That included peaceful protesters, journalists, bystanders. I think a lot of us saw the images that came out of that. And that sent a message, I think, pretty clearly to some lawmakers and policymakers. We need to do something about that. So we've seen a lot of laws introduced to better regulate the use of so-called less lethal weapons, like tear gas and rubber bullets. So, Massachusetts, Oregon, Washington State have all enacted legislation. California just passed some legislation through its assembly. I think it should be signed by the governor in the next week or two. And these, I think, get to a couple kind of main principles on this. One is that these weapons should never be used at a First Amendment gathering. You can never fire tear gas into a protected First Amendment gathering, right? That should just be the law. That is the Constitution, and that's the law. But what kind of created the problem was what happens if you have to like disperse an assembly or that sort of thing? And that's where there was this wiggle room that I think a lot of law enforcement started using. And so these laws also get to just how can you use these weapons for crowd control more generally? So that you have to say, for example, have a warning before you fire tear gas into a crowd. I kind of laugh like you should be able, that should just be common sense, but was not happening last year. That, there's proportionality. You're only going to do it in, when there's threat to life or immediate threat to life, that there's training, there's reporting, other requirements. And so this is one kind of major area of reform we've been seeing in a lot of jurisdictions. We've also been seeing folks focusing on the militarized state of police in this country. And we see this again and again, and there's some studies on this as well, that when police show up in kind of militarized gear, you're more likely to have confrontations. Whether that's because the police are more likely to engage in confrontations because they're dressed that way or because protesters are reacting to how they're dressed. It's unclear which way it goes, but it happens, right? And so there's been a big push to try to demilitarize, so we don't have kind of essentially paramilitaries or these military units that go around our cities like police forces. And so this has been focusing on the 1033 program, where we've been transferring all these weapons, surplus weapons that we have from Iraq and Afghanistan into the streets of US cities. A number of cities have essentially blocked that program or key components of it, saying they won't take these weapons anymore. There's been efforts, unfortunately so far unsuccessfully in Congress, to put new limits on the 1033 program. So there was just an amendment yesterday, unfortunately, that got voted down on the NDAA to limit the 1033 program. But there's a really active campaign that I'm sure many people on this call are aware of to reform that program. We see efforts around surveillance. So the surveillance of protests is something we haven't talked that much about, but it's a big problem. We have a number of cities, including places like New York City, passing legislation that create community control over police surveillance. So we at least have to know what is the surveillance equipment that law enforcement is using against the public, at least have transparency over that. So you see cities doing that. You see places like Massachusetts banning facial recognition technology that has been used in protests, often with this racial bias that's built into the technology. And then, we see a whole host of other things, everything from kind of DOJ ordering that it withholds grants from police and others who violate civil rights, to efforts for just better data collection around protest rights violations, so we can figure out how to have accountability in the system. So there's kind of a whole broad range of things going on.
So I want to answer your question, but I want to speak specifically, I guess, about when these protest laws are still changing and how it's almost changing the fabric of American, culture. As a Florida citizen, when this was passed, I was almost looking at Governor DeSantis like, are you listening to your citizens? Because when I looked at our data, I didn't see where we had a lot of riots in Florida since the 90s. So while we've seen a lot of these anti-riot and protest legislations go across the nation, my concern is, are they really listening to what we are out here protesting about? Because I have not seen the same trend happen, that they're passing legislation to attack police brutality, to attack, either stand your ground issues and all the things we're actually protesting. So again, my cry is, are they really listening to their constituents? Are we really listening to our citizens? Because as we've seen the rise of all this legislation, where's all the rise or of the legislation to protect protesters or to strike down some of these bad policing laws? So again, as an advocate, I, don't want our rights stripped, but I'm also seeing how my nonprofit and our brand can really start to be a better advocate to kind of change things. And preparing for this, the Urban Institute, they had put out data to kind of show nonprofit agencies even spending and reporting more in the area of lobbying, which, generally that's not typically what we do, but, I am in a sense, not lobbying because I'm litigating it, but I am asking for changes. So, because there's been more laws passed, now nonprofits and brands, we're puffering up saying, hey, we have a voice, we can use our brands, we can create standing and really be a vehicle and avenue for change. So I'm hoping we see more of this. I honestly got to this point because as a lawyer, I said, okay, if I want to defend the protesters who are wrongfully arrested and I want to sue companies or governments to take down these things, that requires money and a lot of it. So I utilized my nonprofit, created a fundraiser under Lawyers Matters, and I was trying to raise $100,000 legal fund, and we've reached a fifth of that. But that little $5,000, it fueled a federal litigation to take care of the cost, while I still had to, ask my allies and my colleagues, well, hey, will you be our pro bono attorneys, and or hey, ACLU and some of my other First Amendment cases, will you represent us? I saw how, our little grassroots nonprofit was able to make sweeping change. So I'm hoping this motivates and encourages others that our brands and our nonprofits can really be vehicles and avenues for change, and that we can, utilize other organizations like you all in the ACLU to really be, seminal plaintiffs to do this. So I'm hoping that, this will show legislation, like you guys can pass all the laws you want, but our little grassroots organizations can, collaborate together and build coalitions and partnerships and community partnerships and make a change as well. So I'm hoping we can fight back and advocate for more and sue the powers that be if needed to. And I'm hoping our elected politicians are listening so they can pass legislation so we won't have to, be in these lawsuits. So.
Oh, Shannon, I love this. I have my legal background is I was on the ACLU side for many years. So I thought about, how do you find plaintiffs, meaningful nonprofits? And I think this really kind of segues so perfectly with the final, time we have. Not only is it a question I wanted to ask you both, but we've also gotten in our Q&A a question about what nonprofits themselves can do. And maybe a piece of that is lawsuits, Shannon, as you say. But I also want to figure out, are there other creative mechanisms that nonprofits can employ? Are there other things they can do beyond lawsuits to either advocate to change these laws or to somehow work around them, to support protest and expression? And so I guess I'll start, Shannon, with you. And then Nick, I think it'll be important to just sort of bring in your expertise, both on the nonprofit and, legislative side.
All right. So me being in this space is totally taking me out of my comfort zone. I usually like to stay out of the media and like do my best work, but now I'm like, speak out about this because I'm figuring it out. So my first case that I worked on, I represented a gentleman by the name of Raymond Harisi. And I want to bring this story to light because he was shot 115 times by 5 different police agencies in South Florida. People know it as the Memorial Beach shooting. No one knows my client's name, Raymond Harisi. That was shot 115 times, 115 times. And I always say that 3 times because was it the 5th bullet or the 115th bullet that killed him? My point was litigating that case cost me and my partner almost $250,000. We didn't get the family half of it because we sued the police. But what it did was create reform. And now police officers can't shoot in a moving vehicle in Miami Beach. So that wearing my lawyer hat clued me into like, I can do some things. But what happened was that next year, an artist painted my client a mural of him to memorialize and celebrate his life. The city of Miami Beach took the mural down, we created a lawsuit. I partnered with the ACLU and we sued the city of Miami Beach in this museum based on the First Amendment rights issue. And to bring the story full circle, that taught me then about, my entertainment and protecting artists and using First Amendment and the freedom of speech that we created change. And I was able to get artists compensated that weren't able to otherwise, get compensated through that litigation potentially. And so moving speed ahead to the anti-riot bill, that's kind of the issue I had. I said, I am a legal observer, I volunteer. And my bar rules restrict me from soliciting to find clients and plaintiffs. But then my lawyer reminded me, you're not the lawyer in this case. You're the nonprofit company. You're the brand. Go find you another plaintiff. So I didn't have these non-solicitation issues and rules trying to, find, other co-plaintiffs and nonprofit agencies to work as our plaintiffs. So I was grateful for having a smart lawyer to help figure that out. But also this litigation is very time consuming. It's very, very specific. Like I'm not a First Amendment lawyer. I just happen to do entertainment, which in creative arts, which, falls into that hat, which is very fact, and law specific. So I'm grateful for organizations like the ACLU that, that work in these areas. So us as our nonprofit could partner with them because my buddy and my partner, he was like, Shannon, we are suing the governor. This is costly. And I have a whole day job. And I was telling him, I was like, this is why I wanted you to partner with the ACLU. So, I'm grateful that, I was able to take off my lawyer hat and find other plaintiffs that could really help create standing and, this era is really, showing me, how we can utilize our nonprofits to create change in so many different areas. So sorry for a long story to get to that point, but I just wanted to bring home that, our grassroots organizations, we can do a lot, and with partnering together and creating community partnerships to really move the line on a lot of different issues.
Thanks so much for that. So yeah, I'll kind of answer both parts of that question. So one is, this is always a line we have to walk, particularly in the places where these bills have been enacted. But, we're all about trying to create a space to have people go and protest. So we want people to continue to go protesting when there's an issue that's affecting their life. And we don't want these bills to chill protest as much as they are. So this is always the balance. And so I'd say, first of all, if you're an organization that goes out into the streets, does that, continue to go do that. I do think, and we see this in Florida and elsewhere, that there's much more focus now on trainings before you go and protest for your members, understanding what your rights are, understanding how these laws might affect, might catch up people in a protest. And I think, for a lot of organizations, they have to do kind of a risk assessment because unfortunately, as I said, there's a lot of political discretion in how these laws are enforced. And so just if you protest on certain issues in this country, you're more likely, to be arrested, to face confrontation with the police than if you protest on other issues in this country. That's just unfortunately the way it is. But what I'd say is for everybody, you should go out and, and protest if you want to keep protesting. Second, on engaging these laws, there's this litigation route, and that's really important. And we see how we're getting traction on that in Florida and this good ruling. There's another case that has just been filed against one of the anti-protest bills in Oklahoma. There's also a space, though, I think, to try to reform these laws. I know it's hard in some jurisdictions, in some states, because there isn't a political appetite for it right now. But I think you have to think about the long game on this. And I know, for example, in many states, the way that you walk these laws back is during more general criminal law reform. So when they're looking at the entire criminal penal code, you'll see that that might be an opportunity to kind of like sneak in some changes, but that might not happen until 5 years from now, right? So you have to think about, what is the longer term strategy on this? And then I'd just like to make one last point on just kind of solidarity. So, we work on protest law issues, freedom of assembly issues around the world. And we do so for a lot of reasons. One, because we think it works. It's not just in the US that the suffrage movement or the civil rights movement won all these victories because of protests. That's true wherever you look in the world, right? Wherever you have social movements, protests are critical to winning, these successes in democracies. But we also work on it because, one of the things that governments do when they want to crack down on dissent and on civil society more generally, and this is kind of comes down to like thinking about what's a healthy civic infrastructure for your country, right? Is that protest rights are almost kind of like the canary in the coal mine, right? They're the barometer of the health of your civil society. That, in say, China right now in Hong Kong, they're using overbroad anti-riot laws to go after democracy activists, right? It's no surprise that these laws are used in a lot of different countries to kind of crack down on dissent. And so if you're seeing this happening in the space of protest, and even if your organization or group doesn't do a lot of protest organizations, this is a bad sign for the health of civil society overall. And you need to take these steps to kind of protect civil society or protect the right to protest and facilitate the right to protest. And the way that we've seen the most success, I think, within US history, but also globally, is when civil society comes together, when broad coalitions come together and say, even though I'm not getting targeted in this moment right now, I understand the importance of this right for everyone and for the kind of broader set of causes that I care about. And so I'm going to take a stand now, partly because I believe in the issue, but second, because if we don't take a stand here, we're going to have to take a stand at the next point or the next point or the next point. And eventually one of those points is going to affect me directly. And we all need to be standing now together, or we're going to lose these fights one by one, right? So I just say that as kind of work.
Thank you both. I love that in the final 10 minutes, we now have 3 new questions from the audience and questions in the chat. So I'm going to go through as much as I can and try to kind of merge a few of these, because I think there are some similar threads. One question that's been echoed is just how daunting it can seem, and the need for talking points for a kind of urgency narrative for why this is an issue. And I will myself weigh in to say, I think that we should never underestimate the importance of op-eds and media writ large. The kind of thought leadership, what I think of it as the like steady drumbeat from voices in a diverse array of places and nonprofits really can help shape what is given attention. And this problem is not given enough attention by people who aren't directly affected all the time. That means it's the ACLU and the protest and organizing groups, everyone else that is maybe, as I mentioned at the top, thinking this is an abstract challenge. And so I would just say myself, like, write the op-ed. Write about your employees that are wanting to protest. The fundamental right, as Nick has said, in all of these contexts, that even if it isn't us today or my friends or a group I work with, it may be tomorrow. And the need for talking points, I hear very much. So part of what I've done is put in the chat some of the writing that I have done. Nick has put in his protest tracker. I'll try to continue putting in the chat some things. So that's my attempt to address a few of these. And I see that we're a couple of other things I'd like to turn to now. This is a tough one, but I think we should take it on. How does the partisan perception of these laws intersect with the partisan view of January 6th as a protest versus unlawful riot? I have a lot of thoughts, but I will cede time to the other two experts to say something controversial. Who knows?
Well, I'll defer to Nick, but I just want to say that was kind of my issue with how the protest versus unlawful riot, how it was being marketed, how this bill was being marketed. Like it was speaking to protests, but in the news and media, it was being marketed as anti-riot, as to imply when I go peaceful protest, I'm going to riot. So that was my marketing and branding issue. I feel like the powers that be, or whoever, spoon-fed this to the media, created, kind of the issues on both of the sides to make it an issue. And that's why I was, as a lawyer, me taking this professional risk to utilize my nonprofit to sue on this issue, I was very adamant to my attorney to say, I do not want this to be a racial issue, especially because not only did I sue the governor, but because I sued our local police, who had just quote unquote hired our nonprofit agency to be their legal observers. So again, what they can market and kind of bait these things as, I believe that's, kind of what made it a peaceful protest for versus an unlawful riot issue. And that's my little spill on that.
I'll just say one or two very brief things, and then Nora, if you want to chime in and say, you have thoughts, let you maybe say the more controversial element. But I think the most important thing on this, in kind of big picture, on what's a riot, what's not a riot, is there's already plenty of legal tools in this country to address any violence that occurs, whether it's in the context of a gathering, a riot, a protest, whatever, whether it's one person within 1,000 people, or if it's a January 6th kind of situation, which I think the question alluded to. There's lots of tools on the book already, right? Like I don't have to go in it, but assault and battery is already illegal, right? You can already do that. The problem with things like riot laws and the way that they're crafted in this country is that it captures whole crowds and groups of people who don't have anything to do with those who are engaging in violence, and they capture those who just engage in like the threat of violence. And I think with my lawyer hat on, I think what's important and what gets slipped, I think, in the rhetoric sometimes politically, is you need to have just very targeted laws. Like we all agree we shouldn't have violence, right? And so if there's violence, that can be addressed through the law. But what we're talking about is here different, which is that these laws shall peaceful protest. And I think we just have to keep coming back to that, because you can talk about what about this situation or that situation or that situation, but all those situations are already covered by the law, right? We don't need these new laws.
Just to piggyback off that was my attorney's whole contention. He was like, we didn't even need this law. We have vandalism laws, we have burglary laws, we have, arson laws. So yeah. Again, I think, trying to strip us of these rights and trying to taint what a peaceful protest was part of the issue. Because my other concern was, I grew up, with Black parents that did protest and engage in things. My mom was the first to, segregate her school, and she grew up with, her parents and them being attacked by dogs and fire hydrants and things like that. So my call is, why weren't we having some of these riot and things then, when protesting and things was so violent? When, so again, you have to call into question, why are these things being, passed now, and what is the intention behind it?
Well, I think a lot about January 6th. With my lawyer hat on, like, what is the difference between January 6th and the events that unfolded and other gatherings? So I am thinking about literally just the gathering of bodies in spaces. Like that's all I think about in that sense. And with my lawyer hat on, I believe that there was a period in which what was happening on January 6th was absolutely lawful and protected by the First Amendment. When people were gathering together in that public, the National Mall area, I think that's where it was, around the Capitol, correct me if I'm wrong, which one, that period was a protest, and that was a gathering of people who were able to do that, be in that space, to have signs. However problematic some have felt those messages were, I think we have to recognize that the gathering of people in public spaces is something we need to protect always. And then something interesting happened, in my view, and this happens in a lot of protests, is the kind of spillover. Think about a protest, a BLM protest that spills over from the sidewalk to the street. The difference between the spillover from the sidewalk to the street and what, from video and testimony I have read and seen, appears to be people coordinating and chaotic to infiltrate a congressional certification of election results. That feels, I'm being now less lawyerly, but just like the kind of like, there's a tint there that doesn't feel the same. You know, when people are out in a street, I think that's largely because they feel unheard. And and the attempt to stop or disrupt that certification result felt very core to our democracy. So that's how I think about things. I think there is partisanship woven throughout all of these topics, and we have to recognize that and be careful when we can and nonpartisan. And then we also have to call a spade a spade. And that is why part of what Nick and I have done over the years is really try to just lay out, what are these laws? What are they doing? Who are they chilling? And we cannot be afraid as nonprofit executives to, and other nonprofit officials, to really just like lay bare what we see. It is the reason we have to protect against any mechanism that would silence speech, because it could be us, but it could not be. So I guess with the time remaining, I would love to hear both of your closing just remarks. And I see Nisha's coming on. Nisha, will you let us do some closing comments from Nick and Shannon?
Absolutely.
Thank you. Okay, whoever wants to go first, I'd love to just sort of, as you're thinking about the next year, we're going to see redistricting, a midterm election, potentially more mass, protests, who knows what we'll see. So let's just sort of put this in the context of how we're reclaiming democracy.
So on behalf of our agency, Lawyers Matters Task Force, that's why I started. I saw how important lawyers were and integral to the civil rights movement. So, I trying to keep a temperature on everything that's, important, and really look at what our advocacy points are. So I just want to encourage people, take these professional and creative risk. Like, our nonprofits, they're a line of business that we don't own. It's created for the benevolency of the world and for humanity. So do these risks, take these challenges, get with a great team of lawyers, find great community partners, and raise money and do all the good things. Like, think outside of the box, like the nonprofit online and social fundraising and crowdfunding. You will find your tribe, you will find your circle, and the people that want to advocate on this. So I just want to say, find something you're passionate about, find the people that are passionate about doing it, find the money in the pockets, and make change and inspire the world.
Thanks. Hard to top that. Yeah, so I would just say, first of all, just thanks to everybody for joining, and especially if you haven't been thinking about this issue as much. I think it's just really important, kind of as Nora was saying, that everyone, that it get on people's radar. And I think that's because these bills and this fight over the freedom of assembly isn't going anywhere. We already see a number of these anti-protest bills being pre-filed for 2022. We know that these fights are going to continue, that and that the freedom of assembly is going to continue to be a contested space. And so I just wanted to say thank you really for joining today to figure out, wherever you're coming from on this issue, how you can kind of fit in and show solidarity to say, yes, I recognize this is a problem, and we have to take a stand on it. And this is how I, in my position, can think about doing that. So I'll just end there.
Well, No, I'm turning it back to you, Nisha. Just wanting to say thank you for the opportunity to moderate these two luminaries, and thank you to independent sector for making space for this discussion. Nisha, back to you.
Well, thank you. On behalf of Independent Sector, I would like to thank our speakers for taking the time to share their insights with us today. It goes without saying that civic assemblies are a vital advocacy tool for nonprofits and constituents alike. Without public assembly, many constituents, particularly those from marginalized communities, will be left without a platform to make their voices heard, engage in civic activities, express dissenting opinions, inform policy solutions, and so much more. Nonprofits' ability to advance our missions and policy priorities hinges upon our willingness to ensure that fair and equal access to participation is afforded to all. The resources that were discussed during today's program will be provided in a follow-up email. Thank each of you again for joining us today, and have a good weekend.